Good evening, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 2020 KCLA Address? First of all, can I introduce myself? I'm Diana Garnham, and I'm President of King's College London Alumni Association. And this year, it's a really significant one for us because it marks 100 years since our foundation. During the year, we've managed to cope with COVID and lockdown, and we've had a series of six very interesting COVID conversations, which I hope many of you have enjoyed. I'm delighted to say that within hours, those should be available for people to watch on YouTube, and you can watch them if you missed them first time and revisit them if you wanted to. There were very interesting series of discussions across the breadth of King's, showcasing very, very differing lines of research and study about COVID and its impact on society. The KCLA Annual Address is a really big event for us. It started relatively recently in 2011, but it is our most significant event of the calendar. And every year we look forward to coming together to listen to a distinguished speaker. And of course, we also look forward to catching up socially afterwards. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do the catching up over a glass of wine afterwards this year, but we're sticking to our tradition of inviting a distinguished and impressive speaker to give the address this year. And our speaker will be Professor Sir Edward Byrne, who's the current president and principal of King's College and will be known to many of you. When I was looking up Sir Ed online, the Google search, of course, brings up a famous comedian of the same name. And I might have started with a joke, but decided that might be inappropriate in the circumstances. Sir Ed is very distinguished, and he has led two significant and impressive institutions in different parts of the world. He's a neuroscientist and a clinician by background, as well as finding time to write poetry. He has held a number of leading clinical and research positions, as well as been an advisor on myriad of scientific funding bodies. Under his leadership, he's developed a culture of learning across all the areas of King's, underpinned by a commitment to ensure that King's provided a great education experience for its students. His commitment to develop a new inclusive strategy for the institution engaged with staff, with students, wider stakeholders and alumni, and I know many of those who were on this webinar will have been part of those discussions. He has, I believe, delivered on his aim to consolidate and build King's reputation and position as one of the world's best universities, with real relevance for one of the world's greatest cities, ensuring that King's research outputs are relevant and meaningful for London and the wider world. Under Ed's leadership, King's global ambitions and profile have become very real. But during the past years, and particularly the current year, universities have faced difficult times and challenges. Reflecting on this, Ed has recently co-written a book with former Secretary of State Charles Clarke called The University Challenge: Changing Universities in a Changing World, in which they've tried to set out a vision for universities of the future. And this underpins Ed's topic for today. His topic will be King's Today and Tomorrow, What a Great University Must Contribute to the Wider World. And just before I invite Ed to start, he's going to speak for about 30 minutes, after which we'll have plenty of time for questions. There's a Q&A button on your screens, and if you would like to ask a question, please put it in there and we will come to questions after Ed's spoken. And now over to you, Ed.
Well, thank you very much, Diana. And I think this is the seventh lecture, KCLA annual lecture I've attended. It's my seventh and final year as principal. And I just wanted to acknowledge before I begin the lecture, the incredible support I've had from the presidents and chairs of the KCLA over the last 7 years. And the friendships I've formed both in the UK and around the world. The support the KCLA give to King's as an institution in every way, and notably to our current students, is of course enormous. Well, you've said some of this already, but I'm going to make this, as it's my swan song at King's in a way, a little more personal than I normally would for a talk of this type. I wish I was the comedian because he makes a lot more money than I do, I'm sure, and he's a lot funnier, and you would probably enjoy a lecture by him a lot more, but I will do my best. I was appointed as the principal of King's some 7.5 years ago, and I'm now in my 7th year. I leave the university at the end of January 2021. As has already been alluded to by Diana, I began my career as a consultant neurologist and neurological researcher, and eventually ended up leading large health and medical schools both in London and Australia, before becoming the Vice Chancellor of Australia's largest and most international university, Monash University. And I then undertook the challenge of leading King's. So I came to King's with quite a degree of experience in other universities, and indeed, in a sense, having had two careers, one neurological and in neurological research, and one in academic leadership. As I leave King's, I can say that the last period has been, with the possible exception, and I don't even think that is correct, when I was learning to be a young consultant neurologist, by far the most fulfilling of my career. So why do I say that? King's has always been a fantastic university, and over the last decade or more has found its place again among the strongest academic universities in the world, however measured. To my mind, and again, our president has alluded to this, what has set King's apart in recent years has been the willingness of our community, our whole community, through a vision developed and embraced by our community, to look beyond traditional excellence in education and research, without compromising outstanding performance in those areas, and indeed enhancing them. I refer, of course, to Vision 2029, developed and owned by our community with expert leadership through Jonathan Grant and colleagues a few years ago. This has enabled us to articulate our commitment to both a service and a civic mission in real and tangible ways. And in doing so, we have enhanced our research and educational capacity and our international presence. We can measure this in a number of ways, including our very high ranking in the Times Highest Sustainability Scale, the major measurement of this type, where on both occasions in which it's been run, we've come second in the UK and third in Europe. Really outstanding results. Part of our success has been the outstanding performance across the board of our health schools, but also world-class excellence in the social sciences and humanities, and the recent major strengthening of academic activity in business, the natural sciences, and more recently engineering, which is a journey at an earlier stage. I particularly want to mention KBS, the King's Business School, which has gone from strength to strength in just a few years. I must admit to having a certain bias, because if one looks at what King's has achieved in recent years, for a conservative and historical institution, I believe it's nothing less than spectacular. Of course, I can take little credit for that personally. It's something that has been achieved by the King's community, staff, students, alumni, and friends working together. Well, let me move now to the key theme of this lecture. As President has mentioned, the ideas I'm going to talk about are based on a book recently published, completed and published with Charles Clarke, former Secretary of State for Education and Home Secretary, entitled A Higher Purpose: Changing Universities and Changing Times. My experience as a researcher, teacher, and academic in two hemispheres was complemented by that of Charles as a senior government minister with a great interest in universities from his time as president of the Student Union at Cambridge. We live, as is often said, in times of enormous change and challenge, and it is sometimes a very difficult line indeed to navigate between the devil of complacency and the deep blue sea of unbridled futurism. And in our book, published by Pearson in January, we set out some ideas to stimulate discussion and debate, many of which have already been confirmed by the COVID pandemic. So let me make some challenging statements and see how the audience responds. Pre-COVID, I believe that many people had lost confidence in the university system at a time when arguably these great institutions are more important than they've ever been. Our planet faces huge challenges in the decades ahead. All the creative and innovative capacities of humanity need to be aligned and applied as never before in human history. there are several roads that can be taken by the world for the next few generations, one pretty good and one pretty awful. And universities have a huge role in making sure collectively we go on the right road. Not the only player in that discussion, but a major role. Charles and my central contention in our book is that high quality universities are a crucial, indeed essential contributor to addressing and overcoming the massive challenges the world faces. Of course, universities prepare outstanding young people to become change makers and make their own invaluable contributions across many sectors and fields. Of course, universities drive much of the world's most promising and innovative research and are seen as the jewels in the crown for advanced knowledge-based economies. Universities are superb at bringing great people together from many disciplines and are ideally suited for a multidisciplinary approach to really complex problems. All of the grand societal challenges require an approach of this type. Our contention in the book was that if universities are to perform this role well enough, they must not only continue to excel in more traditional ways, but must perform and adapt to become truly fit for purpose for the challenges we face as a society. But simply, they must find a higher gear and not only do things differently, but do different things if they're going to continue to play the major role they must in their part in taking the world forward in a good way. Well, Charles and I can claim to be prescient, at least a bit. This book was published just before the fantastic response of universities in the United Kingdom and internationally to the COVID pandemic became apparent. I'm going to talk a little bit about King's as an exemplar, because it's something of which I'm personally incredibly proud, but I know that many of the world's great universities responded in a similar way. So let me start with the health faculties. Under the leadership of Robert Leckler and now Richard Trembath, they have performed magnificently. In the service area, as the pandemic was building up, medical students and nursing students were released into the NHS front line, graduating early in some cases, and rapidly moved into active patient care roles. Many clinical academics across the board moved into full-time healthcare roles. In research, we pivoted many of our labs, including many of our greatest researchers, overnight to COVID research in areas ranging from high-level epidemiology, novel work in understanding the psychological and psychiatric impact of the pandemic, innovative immunology research, which is furthering basic understanding of the virus in a very, very major way, and ventilator design, just to name a few areas. Professor Tim Spector's app has achieved worldwide recognition and contributed enormously to our understanding of the clinical phenomenology of COVID. Several of our academics were seconded to the government's SAGE task force. So in research, a fantastic contribution which is ongoing. In education, we pivoted the whole university to online teaching within a few days, delivering a high quality of education and managing to examine our students, including graduating students, online. Amazingly, this was done pretty well. These efforts involved our whole community, staff and students, but I must mention Darren Wallace, Nicola Phillips and Evelyn Welsh, as well as all of our deans and faculty operating officers. You know, universities are conservative institutions, and change is often seen as very major in universities, which would not be seen as so large outside the university world. In the past, we've operated through small and incremental changes and sort of felt our way forward carefully. So the fact that we could make such enormous changes so rapidly and successfully, I think in education, was an eye-opener to many people. Now, that's not the whole story. At the same time, we prepared and have prepared and are now in the midst of a new academic year, unlike any previously seen, with a combination of students in classroom and online in the same session. Again, I must mention the contribution made by the working group centered around Mike Curtis and Joe Kerner from our dental schools to reopening our campuses. Jess Phillips, who led our working group on student and staff wellbeing, a critical activity at this time. Reza Razavi, who has interfaced with the public health authorities and is leading our very comprehensive in-house testing, and not least Chris Modishead, who leaves King's at the same time I do in the next few months, who played with me a pivotal role in coordinating our response. So if anyone doubted the flexibility of universities pre-COVID, the enormous energy and change potential that these institutions have, I'm sure these doubts have been set to rest by the fantastic response to the crisis, not only at King's, but in a number of other UK universities and of course internationally. Well, let me get back to the book, to some of the basic problems that universities continue to face, because they haven't gone away. Some will say that the present reputational issues facing universities across the West are a result of poor communication of what universities do, and there's some truth in that. But Charles, Clark, and I contend it is much more than that, and that there is a need for real change and some humility. The leadership to enable universities to perform their roles effectively must, of course, come from within universities themselves, from not only university leadership, but from university communities, and should not be driven or imposed by government. The role of government should be to encourage and enable transformation to happen, though not necessarily to drive the direction and process of change too closely, although under unusual circumstances that may be necessary. We believe that creating excellence through high degrees of regulatory control is not only impossible, but dangerous. I should say attempts to create excellence, because it doesn't happen. For example, in the UK, there is a danger that the massively increased powers of the new national regulator, the Office for Students, will restrain energy and creativity in the sector. The main guard against that is the rather experienced nature of the individuals who've been appointed to leadership roles initially in the OFS. The journey of King's in recent years can, I think, be regarded as something of a step change, certainly over the last 15 years, showing that accelerated change for the better is possible. This has involved a coordinated drive for excellence, overseen by outstanding councils and owned by the university community broadly. Well, it's commonplace to point out the rapid changes to the extent where even recent generations would have found it difficult to understand the world in which our children and grandchildren now live. Let me highlight a few obvious areas. Let me start with work. Work and its associated income has been at the core of our societies and economies, of course, forever, but it has changed and is changing incredibly rapidly. This relates to who is working, where work takes place now, and how work is done. Just look at how things have changed in response to the COVID pandemic, and how many of these changes may be bedded in, at least in part, going into the future. Differences in occupation types and of work patterns, driven in part by the development of automated systems and artificial intelligence, at times have a revolutionary flavor. If you doubt this, look at how modern IT technology has enabled so many people to work effectively from home over the last 9 months. The largest and most powerful companies after the Second World War, and indeed of 30 years ago, are either non-existent or greatly diminished. Young people think of Google and Apple in the way that my generation thought of IBM and Kodak, and my parents thought of GM and Ford. Joseph Aoun, president of one of North America's significant universities, Northeast, sets this out clearly in a great book, which I'd commend to you, Robot-Proof Higher Education in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Here, he states, the only real certainty is that the world will be different, and that with change comes challenge as well as opportunity, as we all know. In many cases, they are indeed one and the same, and education, I believe, is what sets them apart. So how well will my world, the university world, position itself to react to all of this? This is a key question. Our response to COVID, the flexibility and forward-looking energy we've shown, makes me very optimistic that as a sector and as an individual institution, we will succeed. The university world is often fairly left-wing in its politics, yet retains a highly conservative mentality in respect of its institutional culture and professional practice. And as I've already said, thinks of change in small or modest increments. Small changes that would be seen in many other sectors of society as modest, can be seen historically as exceptionally challenging and difficult to achieve in universities. This mindset has started to change with the COVID pandemic and needs to change even more rapidly. Our response to COVID proves that we have no problem when there is no choice. The most successful vice chancellors I have seen operate in, and I hope I've adopted this model myself to some extent, I've certainly tried to, work in a flat, non-hierarchical and collegiate structure and work to influence others as much as possible rather than to direct. Collegiality is central to successful university culture, and a key challenge is how to accelerate change without diminishing that sense of community. Staff and students can be trusted to take advantage of opportunity and to take very seriously their responsibility for success for the outputs of the institution. The response to COVID at King's, developed in a very collegiate way, has again shown that to be the case. Well, let me go back to some more general issues equally significant in normal times and COVID times. These include the domains of communication and travel, family and social structure, and health and longevity. I could mention others, but that's enough to be going on with. Poverty has been alleviated more rapidly for billions of people than at any time in human history, but many, many more must be taken out of poverty in the years ahead. And of course, the recession that we're about to enter into worldwide will make that more difficult in the short term. Yet the most optimistic international thinkers, such as Steven Pinker, Hans Rosling, and Yuval Noah Harari, among others, have huge confidence in the capacity of the human to succeed and to overcome the challenges of biological aging and environmental degradation with ongoing prosperity for all. This will be hugely difficult to achieve. It will only even partially happen with a maximum output and input from universities across the world. At this time, developed economies, and I think we'll all agree with this, have become less equal, with tiny numbers of people possessing an enormous proportion of the world's assets and not always using their money and power well. Sometimes, of course, for example, the Gates do use their money and power well. While science has continued to strengthen in capacity and potential, there has been some loss of confidence in the scientific process as a whole by the general public. Perhaps most clearly seen through the increasingly vocal anti-climate science voice, often most manifest on the right side of politics, which seems at times to thrive on denigration of scientific opinion. Things that seem to the scientific world as robust as gravity are denied. And it is really hard for people like myself who've been brought up in the scientific tradition to understand how society, to a significant extent, has gone in this direction. Another example, which is very topical, this is becoming even more apparent through the anti-vax movement, which has the capacity to do so much harm when effective vaccines for COVID are now starting to be with us. So, universities have a crucial role to play in combating the view that alternative truths are acceptable, which seem to be pushed sometimes by people in positions of great power. And this may be a contentious statement, but it sometimes seems to me they do it for their own personal benefit. Seemingly almost overnight, we have moved from a mindset where politics and public life are international and global to a resurrection of populist and nationalist politics, which so bedeviled the world in the early part of the 20th century. This unrest is driven in part by fundamental changes in the nature of society and work, which have caused industrial desolation in parts of Europe and areas like the Midwest and Rust Belt of the US. And of course, the parts of the UK also that fall into that category. Internal and external cross-border mass migration provoked by social, environmental, and economic transformation is one consequence of this. This has become associated with loss of confidence by many in both national government and perhaps even more in international institutions like the United Nations. Just look at how faith in the World Health Organization, an organization that I, with my medical background, would have thought was absolutely sacrosanct, has developed in the COVID world to the extent that the world's most powerful nation is actually on the verge of leaving the WHO when international health collaboration is so crucial. Of course, if the election result in the States is confirmed, that won't happen. Attempts to dispute beneficial developments, such as the focus on UN Millennium Development Goals and the new Sustainable Development Goals, are illustrations of things that in a more normal world should be universally supported. I'm sure this audience needs no convincing that we live in one of those times which is a pivotal point in history, certainly not seen for almost 100 years. In my more inward-looking moments, I do think it is a time that has a great deal of similarity to the 30s, as noticed by many commentators. I do hope it is not so pivotal a moment in European history as the fall of the Western Empire in the mid-5th century, which of course led to what was once referred to as the Dark Ages. I'm sure that won't happen, but it's up to all of us on this call, and to universities in particular, to play a huge role in preventing that. Charles Clarke and I believe that universities have 4 key attributes to help the world deal with accelerating change, which is the issue we face, accelerating change like never before. These attributes can be set out quite simply as understanding and interpreting the processes of change, offering approaches that harness the processes of change for general benefit, educating and training high-quality specialist workers whose skills are necessary to address change properly, and underpinning all of this, creating a general intellectually engaging climate and culture across societies, which promotes the virtues of both understanding in a societal sense, including a sense of community, underpinned by science in the fullest sense. Universities have never had more opportunity or responsibility as highly interdisciplinary institutions in addressing grand challenges which require increasingly independent and interrelated approaches. Clearly, these approaches must cover the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences, indeed all aspects of a great university such as King's. Our approach at King's has been exactly aligned to this worldview in recent times. Examples include the establishment of the Policy Institute in Sir Rick Trainor's time, which has continued to grow and has had spectacular benefits and provided support for the UK government in many areas. The establishment of the International Institute for Women in Leadership, led by former Australian PM Julia Gillard as Executive Chair, and the School for Government at King's in partnership with the Civil Service in more recent years are already starting to pay off. Perhaps even more significantly, the attitude of King's academics and of our students and professional staff has veered strongly towards interdisciplinarity, driven from the ground up across the board. There are so many examples at King's of colleagues from different disciplines working together around the great issues of the country and the world. And this is seen also in terms of the fantastic range of degrees we now offer at both undergraduate and postgraduate level. So I've looked internally a bit. Let's look a little outside the UK. There are striking examples already of what universities could do. Arizona State University in the United States is pioneering a new model of excellence with inclusivity as its beacon. I might say that ASU is our North American partner with King's in an alliance with the University of New South Wales we call Plus Alliance, which has been a fantastic development for our institution. Warwick University in England has led the industrial rejuvenation of the Midlands, and the Australian National University in Canberra, as I must mention one Australian institution, plays a full role in Australian national life and as our partner at King's and the Menzies Australia Institute. There are many other examples. I've just drawn out a few. There are countless examples of areas where university research in recent times has underpinned advances in human health. There are so many examples, it's hard to pick any out. Robert Leckler, in his brilliant King's Lecture series this year, highlighted a number. I would include the sequencing of the human genome, the massive advances in regenerative medicine based on stem cell research, treating HIV, Zika virus research, the human papilloma virus vaccination discovered by Ian Fraser in Australia, surgical advances in health, and real advances in understanding mental health, where King's has been so prominent. beyond and overlapping with health breakthroughs have, if anything, been even more profound advances in engineering, the new information world. AI, increased understanding of the nature of humanity through the arts and humanities, and social science advances, the list goes on. And of course, I've mentioned already in this talk, the fantastic work done by universities collaborating across the world in breakthrough in the COVID era. And this has just been amazing, from the first sequence of the virus to the development of a number of effective vaccines occurring within a year as a massive international effort involving great universities in many countries, including a number in our region here. Outcomes of university research are driven by the desire to expand life quality and expectancy, lower child mortality, eliminate disabling diseases, and have healthier populations on the health side. All of these breakthroughs in basic science have sociological implications that flow into the humanities. Our ability to take a broad view of things at King's is one of the real strengths of our university. Just look at the ethical implications of new science, which requires innovative work in philosophy, ethics, public policy, and law to complement the scientific advances. The academic community of a great multi-faculty university such as ours is ideally placed to drive these ideas forward, and indeed that is exactly what we've been doing in so many areas. I've already mentioned more than once a little about how COVID has provoked such a dramatic response in drawing us together. We have pivoted around national and international need almost overnight, and this has involved every part of our institution, our university. Many of the contributions we have made nationally are in the fields of psychology and biology, as well as in the natural sciences and engineering. So just a further word about university research. I've presented a somewhat glowing picture to date, but in fact, the distribution of the quality of research in our country, the UK, across different universities is a little variable. If we look at the UK, of the UK's approximately 160 universities, about 50 would have a good claim based on data to be producing substantial amounts of world-class research that will influence the human journey. It is, of course, true that there are areas of real excellence in a wider range of institutions, but it is a fact that in many countries, including the UK, research excellence is highly concentrated. I believe it's time to more fully recognize the varied mission and nature of our universities. In our country, we have universities which are linked to serving local communities, universities whose main function is to produce a highly educated workforce, and universities such as King's, which have a more traditional research university role, combining research with an absolute responsibility for high-level education. No type of institution is more important than another. It's this breadth of institutions of different types coming together that make an effective national university structure, that much abused word ecosystem, an effective national ecosystem in higher education. I believe the only way we'll get to this point in the UK is if we follow countries such as Germany and to some extent France and abandon the hierarchical view we currently have of our institutions. As I've just said, I don't think any university's mission is more important than another's, although universities should acknowledge some differentiation of mission. If we get to that point, this may lead to a more effective university system nationally. One conceptual difficulty that will be raised by by many academics hearing what I've just said, that we will have to overcome to get to this point, relates to the concept of research-led teaching. Research-led teaching, as at King's, is one example of outstanding university education, but I don't believe it's the only way that outstanding university education can be delivered. By that, I mean having individuals who are highly research active deliver the great bulk of the education personally. Much excellent education in the United Kingdom's universities today is not occurring in a research active environment, but is occurring in an environment where there is a good knowledge of research and new knowledge that is research informed, a subtle but important difference. The concept coming into the Western university tradition originally from Berlin, that research and education must be completely coexistent in great universities, is true, but it is not exclusive. It is time to objectively reflect existing reality in terms of the university system in our country. So, just dwelling on this theme a little more in the UK, in recent times, rather than concentrating on the distribution or the co-distribution of research and education and whether all universities should be research intensive, of greater concern in our country recently has been the quality and utility of teaching and learning in universities across the board. It can be argued that in recent times, I believe this has changed quite dramatically and quite quickly, that some academic staff, even in the greatest institutions, have been more focused on their research interest and on their teaching responsibilities. And of course, for some, this is entirely appropriate. But for our workforce as a whole, the worldview that downplays the importance of education as a generality in academic communities is no longer fit for purpose, and of course it never was. The development of the teaching excellence framework in the UK has shown some disconnect between research and teaching excellence. This is seen, for example, by the TEF performance, the Teaching Excellence Framework performance of most Russell Group institutions, with the caveat that teaching quality is, of course, extremely difficult to measure. The concept of value added that government has been very keen on until recently is even more difficult to measure. It is certainly not intended in this short lecture to give any historical overview, slow and sometimes accelerated. The largely monastic type institutions of the Dark Ages, culminating in the rise of the great University of Paris, the Italian universities, and then Oxford and Cambridge, were characterized by communities of scholars living together, often with a religious bent. They were succeeded perhaps by something that could be considered a guild model, again somewhat isolated from the outside world, and eventually leading to the University of Berlin, Johns Hopkins, and everywhere else. The prominence of the Scottish universities in driving the Scottish Enlightenment cannot be overstated. The significance of the University of Berlin and the German university system as the primary destination of many scholars from across the world for almost a century was pivotal, and the Johns Hopkins model, as we know, has been widely adopted. Well, we've moved on. As always, as universities evolve, we take much with us from the past. Outstanding research and research leadership, centers of novel thought and innovation across many disciplines, outstanding education across the board, not only in a disciplinary sense, but in a human sense, the development, and I might say perhaps aspirationally, a guiding of young people in a Cardinal Newman sense. This is towards exemplary citizenship and an ability to think laterally, to tolerate some degree of ambiguity. No one could say that universities have not adapted effectively to change needs over the last 50 years. Well, what about areas in which we've done less well? The equity area stands out. Enrollments from the lowest socioeconomic quartile of the United States is pathetically low, and the UK, in spite of a more generous degree of government funding for decades, has really not done much better. We've done better in gender terms in enrolling women in university degrees. Across the board, we still need to do a lot better in terms of racial equity in many of our institutions, especially Oxbridge. This is one area where King's has done particularly well, with more than half of our students coming from a BAME background. These are clearly areas, however, in which we need to continue to improve. The impetus we've been given by the murder of George Floyd and by overt concentration on eliminating racism from our institution has been powerful and continues to have a real effect, which will evolve for some time to come and will improve the quality of university experience for many of our students and staff. Let me turn to work again. Work matters, of course, now as much as ever for young people coming to university, and having a successful career is a significant part of their motivation for almost all. Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic Forum, has written persuasively about the economic and social change currently underway in the workforce. The first industrial revolution saw water and steam power to accelerate production. The second used electric power to create mass production. The third used electronics and information technology to automate production. And now the fourth industrial revolution is building on the third, the digital revolution that has been occurring since the beginning of the last century. It is characterized by fusion of technologies that is blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological sphere, directly quoting Schwab. The first of these industrial revolutions was mainly located in the UK and then in Germany, and the fourth is mainly located in Silicon Valley and has rapidly spread into China, notably around Shenzhen, where King's is developing its new China Medical School. Most commentators would consider the above analysis to be uncontentious. In this lecture, I'm not aiming to discuss the rights and wrongs of this assessment, but to indicate that universities across the world have a key responsibility to understand and interpret and prepare for a world where such changes are taking place so rapidly. Nowhere is this dramatic impact more evident than in the world of work, with new kinds of skills and knowledge central to our rapidly evolving economies. Universities will and are playing a central role in educating young people for the work and roles of today and tomorrow, as they have always done in the past. Turning again to Joseph Aoun, these changes, deep, wide-ranging, are not only technical, but also philosophical and ethical as the nature of work and its dominant place in society changes. Now, some of the pivotal changes, careers for life are in steep decline. The skills and insights which almost everyone needs in most areas of employment are changing. J.P. Snow's two cultures is even less defensible now than 60 years ago. The weakening in basic mathematical skills seen in the UK, but much less so in China and Germany, has led to a workforce which may be ill-prepared for the technological demands of the new century and even lacking the analytical capacity needed for effective citizenship. Aoun has stressed the need to develop capacities in people which differ from those of machines. These include, of course, creativity, mental flexibility, sociability, and imagination, perhaps more than anything. A far greater number of jobs require high-level technical and analytical expertise. Work by think tanks, such as the Royal Society of Arts, illustrates these points. The traditional US university model in many institutions of a broad undergraduate experience focused into working skills in graduate school may be more applicable than that typical in the UK of a more focused undergraduate degree. And at King's, we're trying to move beyond this. In our undergraduate degrees, we're now moving to provide broad thinking without losing disciplinary focus. Universities will focus more and more around later entry points for education, often for a third or fourth career. In all areas of endeavor, constant retraining or updating of information and thought process is already essential. Universities have not been nearly as prominent in this field as we should, but I believe that will change in the years ahead. Modern technology, as we've seen in the current crisis, allows much greater flexibility in how educational offerings can be delivered than was ever possible in the past. We're seeing new modes of delivery, flexibility of course structure, and different systems of delivering education emerge and consolidate rapidly. And the traditional university model that we've grown up with, I think, will change quite quickly. It is crucial for academics to accept, which most have already done, that developing and designing courses is enhanced if they work with colleagues from outside universities, from business, industry, and the professions, who have incredibly valuable ideas about modular and course structure. We are really doing that now at King's in a major way, and Charles and I expand on that more in our book. Let me move on to something controversial as I come towards the end of this lecture. Probably said enough controversial things. I would contend that university research, arguably outside health, has not historically been as closely aligned with national and international priorities as it might, but has been driven by individual curiosity. And in the main, that's been a good thing. This has been a powerful, welcome, and essential force for knowledge advancement. But if combined with an outmoded ivory tower philosophy, inhibits maximum benefit for society at large. And what we're seeing now in this country is more effective integration of university research in all disciplines with national and international need. The funding is more and more in that direction. I could say something about London, about King's civic role in London, which has been immense. We are now recognised as London's civic university, and universities are important not just to nations and to international communities, but to the world around them. And the massive amount of work we're doing in London is exemplary. I'd also like to mention service. King's has driven in the UK the idea that service is a key aspect of great modern universities, doing things for society at large in broad and innovative ways. So let me finish with Cardinal Newman. Newman, of course, one of the great university educators, felt that the role of the university was to produce well-rounded young people fitted for life. In recent times, our government has talked at times about graduating alumni who could do graduate level jobs as being one of our main educational undergraduate mission, and Newman would not have liked that. Of course, we must do that, but we must also never forget Newman's essential message of assisting young people to become well-rounded citizens fit to take their place in the world and live a full and enjoyable life. Well, I've touched on a few things very rapidly in this diverse lecture, which you're probably relieved to hear is now coming to an end. At the end of this talk, I just wanted to say that I'm so grateful to my colleagues at King's, staff, students, and alumni for the support you have given me in my time as principal. I'm grateful for the friendships I've formed and for the inspirational examples of human behavior at its very best that I've seen across the institution. I also wish to give a special thanks to the two chairs of council I've reported to, Lord Douro, later the Duke of Wellington, and Lord Geit, and to other members of council for the real support they've given the university community in my time as principal. King's is a university that in every sense is in service to society. In every sense, its mission is to make the world a better place. So many thanks for listening, and I'd be very happy to answer some questions or take part in some discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ed. Now for that tour de force across a lot of issues facing universities now and the way they're changing for the future. We have quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and go through these slightly chronologically on your talk. You mentioned the need for humility in higher education. And we have an anonymous question here that references a quote from Amy Edmondson of Harvard Business School about genuine humility, a very powerful stance, zero reason not to have it. I just wondered whether you were also suggesting from that whether universities should be listening more to the wider stakeholders. And later in your talk, you mentioned many areas like business and the professions with whom universities might work more closely.
Yes, that's exactly what I was alluding to, that, look, I think this has been improving steadily for some time, but not that long ago, the great universities were institutions perfect and complete unto themselves. They were influenced little by the outside world, and they thought they knew their business best. I think it's now apparent that the performance of universities is improved dramatically if they're porous and fully engaged with the societies around them. That's what I mean by humility.
Excellent, thank you. And we have a couple of similar questions around what you were saying about a post-truth or a denial type culture, and how do we get ideas and good discussion and open thinking into wider society. One question is, can you use the alumni networks more to engage with a wider community, so filtering through them into a wider community? And there's another question linked to this from Brian Sutton, which wondered, he's linked it to academic freedom, whether there is a tension here between giving academics the right to their say, but guarding against potentially poor messaging and perhaps confusing the public in getting conflicting views. And that's particularly relevant around COVID-19, where you've got early and untested thinking.
Yes, I think
what's the university role?
Well, they're good points. Look, I think the key role of the university is to equip our students with an analytic capacity so they can make informed judgments. Um, you know, there are a sort of range of things. I think, you know, to me, there are many issues where legitimate debate has a real place because the answers aren't known or there's more than one legitimate viewpoint. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that debate in academia and at every level of society around those issues is not crucial. But you know, when issues reach a point where if you fall out of the window, you definitely hit the ground and there's something called gravity, you know, disputing that or disputing the fossil record seems untenable in terms of an educated, informed, and analytical approach. Now, the difficulty we have is that the rise of social media has made it possible for people with more marginal views to find a following. And in the wider information world, the dominant approach is not now by everybody the analytical and scientific one. You know, so we have a situation where, you know, I think it's fair to say an American president has devalued truth in many of his comments. We have the situation where many aspects of the mainstream media don't value, you know, what one would regard as reasonably certain truths in the way they did in the past. And it's very hard for the common citizen to differentiate different views when prominent people are saying climate change is a lot of rubbish on the one hand, and pretty much every scientist in the world is saying something different. And I think this is where university communities do have a role through our staff, our students, and our alumni networks by acting as a cohesive voice for a more rational approach to the analysis of information. Holding people who promote alternative truths accountable is part of that mission.
Thank you. You talked about the relationship of universities with government and regulators, and I've got a question here from Benjamin Hunt, which is on regulatory intervention, what is the terrain that you feel is legitimate for intervention in higher education for the regulator, and where could this be done to improve, I've lost it now, where improve the experience of students effectively?
Well, Ben knows a great deal about that himself. I think the most effective student experience comes from great institutions who've worked out internally and within themselves the unique education they wish to offer. Where government comes in is to enforce minimum levels of standard, and they must do that because we must have a bar that no institution in any civilized country is performing below. And I don't think government has a much greater role than that in determining the quality of education, because I don't think it is in any way possible to drive up the quality of education through hyperregulation. I think all that does is force uniformity, kills creativity, and greatly reduces the significance and independence of universities. The two things universities need to flourish are sufficient funding, wherever it comes from, and sufficient autonomy. And wherever autonomy is interfered with, and my belief is that's gone too far in the UK in recent times, the effects end up being disastrous.
That, in a sense, leads to a question that you didn't look at in great depth, which is who pays?
I realized I was running out of time, so I eliminated those few paragraphs from the talk. I did have them in. I think that's fascinating because we have a chapter on this in the book, and both Charles and I have strong views on this. But our views aren't exactly aligned, but they're pretty close. You know, in the UK and Australia, the countries we've analysed most, it looks very different on the surface. Who pays in the two countries, but at the end of the day, it's the same. So in the UK, I'm talking about domestic students, they borrow their money, the government underpins the loan pool, and the institution has paid for domestic education. A lot of the loan pool is written off, and certain courses have specific supplementation. So there is a significant government subsidy, but it comes very late in the piece. Often after people have been struggling with these loans for more than half a lifetime. So you could say that the philosophy in the UK has moved in one sense towards user pays. The late abolition of the loan pool is perhaps a modifying factor. The late remission of the loan. But that is based on a sort of view that the only person benefiting from a university education is the student themselves. And my view, and Charles, of course, is that society benefits enormously in two ways. I mean, one, it benefits from having better educated citizens who can play a fuller role in all sorts of ways. And secondly, it benefits by having people appropriately trained for its workforce needs for many, many professions and jobs. And for that reason, we believe that there should be an overt, as in Australia, public upfront contribution to students' education, to the paying for students' education, and that a hybrid public-private model recognized up front is the optimum outcome. We think there should be some private contribution because we think there is a definite private benefit to university education, and it's unfair for young people who never go anywhere near a university and their families to shoulder the burden through the tax base completely for those students lucky enough to go to university. But we very much favor the mixed funding model with a public good contribution recognized through the tax base and a private contribution supported by a loan pool, but somewhat less than it is in the UK at the moment.
Thank you. And of course, if you took that model, then it gives government the opportunity to tweak the ecosystem, incentivize it in particular ways by investing in a certain type of education for a certain group of people.
Exactly, and it also ensures that the jobs of the future will evolve more rapidly. The Industrial Revolution 4.0 jobs, the jobs that will dominate in many aspects of the workforce just a few years from now, that we didn't even know what they were a decade ago.
There's a couple of questions I'd like to link here. One from Ivy Glavie, which says, what are the soft skills needed to be a leader of change? So your future, I think that's a reference to what are you going to be teaching? And another question that's anonymous, but you talked about what universities needed to do to have equip students for the future, to make critical judgment and to have to develop their careers. So what are the specifics that you're introducing into the King's curriculum that will deliver that?
Let me talk about King's, because I think this is an area where we've developed a leading position in the UK. We've had a project called Simplification of Our Curriculum. Now, that is not to offer less opportunity to students, very much the opposite. We'd had led a 10,000 flowers bloom philosophy and, adding in modules, courses, willy-nilly. So in many areas, there was not the degree of cohesive intellectual structure that we would have liked. So we've moved to, I guess, what you might think of as a more major minor model with a more limited number of degrees, but a richer range of opportunity in each degree and cutting across all of our educational offerings, some general education themes. Education for citizenship, an international mindset. That's been a huge thing we've been developing. It's quite hard to explain how we do these things, but toleration of ambiguity, analytical capacity, certainly management of complex issues, how to disagree with people in a civilized way, and analyze the viewpoints of others. And of course, all of this stuff, which sounds quite theoretical in one sense, is massively valuable to young people when they get into the workforce and when they're working in teams and they're working with people from different backgrounds and cultures. Funmi Olanasakin, who you know, with Nicola Phillips, has been leading this massive project, simplification of the curriculum led by Nicola, and then leadership and internationalization led by Funmi, embedded across our course network. I mean, it seems a little trite as I say it, but I genuinely believe that we're getting much better at ensuring that when students leave King's, they're equipped for aspirational lives with an aspirational mindset.
Thank you. Quite a specific question here about how well did the science or courses that needed extensive apparatus or chemicals transfer to online learning over COVID-19?
It was difficult. You know, you can deliver science courses that require laboratory experience online, and there are examples of that around the world. Of course, it's extremely difficult because getting a chemistry kit in the post and then doing an experiment with your tutor online is not the same as being in a lab. So for the complete lockdown, the first lockdown, when we had to do everything online, it was difficult, I think, to do those courses in the same way. We did our best, I would say. But in this more recent lockdown, we've been allowed to keep the university in large part open. So all laboratory experiences, all clinical training, everything that requires physically in-person presence and musical training, for example, education, the students are all continuing to attend in person during the second lockdown.
Thank you. I think we're now drawing an end to the time we have with you. One of the questions here, which is very personal, is what will you miss most when you move on from King's?
I've loved King's. I'll miss two things. I mean, I'll miss the people, the students, because students have been a massive part of my life forever. I'll miss the fantastic colleagues and the opportunity to be immersed in such a brilliant university. I have got a part-time appointment at the Australian National University in Canberra in Australia, so it's nothing like the depth of engagement I have at King's, and certainly not a leadership role, but at least I will be hanging around a great university. But the other thing I'll miss is London. You know, London to me, I grew up in the north of England, but went to Australia as a young teenager, and I've lived mainly in Melbourne, but I've had 3 long stints in London. This is the 3rd, so I've lived in London for getting up for 20 years and all. And I love London. I mean, to me, London is the world's great city. It always will be. London will always be a pivotal part of my life and my wife's, Melissa. It's just a shame for us that, but of course, London has a showing great spirit to the whole thing, but it's a shame for us that our last few months here, as we get towards the 7-year mark, is in this time of COVID. When this fantastic city is so quiet, but it has to be. I mean, we're all doing what we have to do, and we'll be frequent visitors to London and to King's when it's back to normal in the years ahead.
Lovely, thank you very much. Well, I hope you'll be a frequent link with KCLA as well after you move on.
Very much.
Thank you very much, Ed, for a fantastic and stimulating talk. We have lots of unanswered questions as well, so thank you to our audience for your full engagement. I'm now going to hand over to Barry Morgan.
Thank you, Principal, for giving to KCLA your essentially your, I gather, only valedictory address. I joined King's as long ago as 1967. And I joined very much an ivory tower. And looking back over those 50 plus years now, it is striking how quickly things have changed and how change accelerates. I remember your collaborator, Charles Clarke, when he was Minister of Education, saying, universities exist to enable the British economy and society to deal with the challenges posed by the increasingly rapid process of global change. Mm. And this caused quite a stir, quite a controversy at the time. And yet, looking back, it seems a quite unexceptional statement. I think you've outlined the challenges that universities have faced, continue to face, in particularly an international context. While there's been acceptance that universities are in many ways the drivers of competitive economies, I think that we increasingly need, as you have emphasized, to look at the international element of collaboration and the crucial role of universities in this terrible post-truth world that we live in. Mm. I can't let this opportunity pass of being able to thank you for your lecture without also thanking you on behalf of an incredibly proud alumni body of your outstanding leadership and stewardship of King's for the last 7 years. It's a matter of great regret to us all that we've had to, we've been unable to meet you in person during the traditional after address reception to thank you personally. It is summary measure of the esteem in which you're held that so many people have logged in and listened to your talk online. To continue on a personal theme, I left King's in 2002. It was a good, but not outstanding university, or college as we used to call it then. We certainly lagged behind UCL, Imperial and LSE. At the end of January, when you leave, you will retire from a King's which is firmly established as one of the world's top universities. The profile of the college, sorry, I still talk about it as a college, the profile of the university has changed so substantially. In 2002, when I left, there was next to no social science in King's. There was a few of us in geography who were social scientists. There were a few in war studies. But other than that, we had no other real social scientists. We had no public policy. So that you and your predecessor, particularly Professor Traynor, have driven King's to a totally new level of standing, while at the same time very substantially changing the academic profile, so that we now have world-leading departments and faculties across the board, whereas previously that concentration of excellence was more limited. So we really can't thank you enough for the last 7 years. Finally, might I thank you on behalf of KCLA for the unstinting support that you have given us over the last 7 years. You will be sorely missed. Thank you.
So we can't all clap, but thank you very much, Ed, from all of us.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful. And Ken, I wish you all well in these difficult times and beyond. And aren't we all lucky to be associated with such a fantastic university as King's? Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.